Okay, back to that original graph I had in the first slide or two of the notes for this section. The question now is, does this graph have any absolute maximums or minimums? And remember, the word absolute is a big difference. It means largest everywhere, okay, or smallest everywhere. So, does this have any absolute maximums? Well, let me plug in the points that we talked about. Remember, these points are known. This was -4, 3. This is 5, 2. This is the ordered pair 1, -2. Okay. Well, this graph does have an absolute maximum. It has an absolute maximum right here. Okay. Why? Well, because it's the largest y value. This point has the largest y value anywhere on the graph. Okay. Now, this point is a relative maximum, but it's certainly not the absolute maximum. Okay. The y-coordinate is 2 here, and I see I definitely have a point with a larger y-coordinate than 2. So this is an absolute maximum. Okay. Now, 2 points can tie for the absolute maximum or the absolute minimum, or 3 points for that matter, but you generally just have one of these things. You don't have many of them like you do relative maximums and minimums. Now, if I had another point that had as a highest y-coordinate 3, then that would also be called an absolute maximum. Okay. But in this case, just one. Okay, what about absolute minimum? Well, we had a relative minimum over here at 1, -2, but that's not an absolute minimum. Okay, the y-coordinate here is -2. Okay, and there are points on this graph that have a much larger negative y-coordinate, or I guess you could just say a much smaller y-coordinate. Okay, now since the graph curves down, in fact to both sides it curves down eventually, there is no minimum y-coordinate we can find anywhere. Okay, if the graph had a distinct bottom, then we would say that's the absolute minimum. Okay, so this is a relative minimum, but there is no absolute minimum because we can't find a lowest point on the graph. The graph moves further and further down. So absolute maximum at -4, 3, no absolute minimum. Okay, and that's fine. When you look at a function on a big interval, if it continues to curve down, there's no absolute minimum. If it curves up indefinitely, there's not going to be an absolute maximum.